and my welcome to this new series of seminars this term, looking at Christian-Muslim relations here in the UK, but of course that inevitably leaks into the rest of the world as well. It's in our globalized world impossible to isolate ourselves. I must say that Richard doesn't quite know how long he's going to speak for. These are work in progress seminars, and this work is more in progress than normal, and partly because there's just such a volume of material, and partly because I probably didn't quite time my preparation right. So if things are a little bit rough around the edge, that's because I probably needed a little bit more time. But the fact that it is a work in progress also means that we can open this up for discussion. And after I've finished, I really would like to have not just your questions, but to discuss some of the things that have been raised, hear some of your own stories. I'd be very, very happy to hear of other examples or other reviews or other opinions, other case studies. That would be great as well. It is a very contentious topic that we're looking at, and some of the things that we're talking about are difficult things. And so I think in a conversation like this, we do need to have grace for one another. We need to listen carefully. And I would just emphasize that a lot of what I'm sharing today aren't necessarily my views. I very much tried to look at the views of a whole range of different Christians who I will mention in a moment. So I'm just going to share my screen, and we can see that our topic today is we're looking at British Christian responses to Islamophobia. And I wonder what comes into your mind when you hear that term. What do you immediately think of? For some of us, we might think of all of the debate around definitions. We'll see quite a bit of the definition, or quite a few of the definitions in a few moments. But you might think of different reports that have come out, and the controversy that there has been around those reports or those definitions. Maybe you think of cases that have arisen out of accusations of Islamophobia. This was a case in Australia with Pastor Daniel Scott, who was found guilty of religious vilification there, and we'll touch on that case as well. So maybe it stirs up thoughts of legal cases, including a restriction on things like preaching in public. This was a pastor who was arrested in London for preaching on the streets, and somebody accused him of Islamophobic language, and he was arrested by the police, who later retracted the arrest and had to pay out to him for wrongful arrest. Or you might think of Trevor Phillips. Trevor Phillips was somebody who was involved in the whole question of race, Islamophobia. He was part of the first Runnymede report trying to define Islamophobia, and yet a couple of years ago was expelled from the Labour Party because of his supposed Islamophobic views. And so he himself ran foul of the definitions of Islamophobia. And so maybe those are some of the things that come into your mind when you think of Islamophobia. There's another whole set of things that might come into your mind as you think of this topic. Maybe you'd think of Mohammed Salim, an 82-year-old grandfather who was stabbed to death on his way home from prayers in the Birmingham area. Or another grandfather, Mohsen Ahmed, who died after being attacked in the street on his way to prayers in Rotherham. Maybe you think of somebody like this man, Darren Osborne, who drove all the way from Wales to drive his van into a crowd of Muslims outside of a mosque in Finsbury Park, killing one man there. Or attacks in the street where Muslim women have had the hijab ripped off their faces, or faced all sorts of language and actions that have vilified them. Or maybe the absolutely iniquitous, spiteful letters that were sent out in 2018 in the so-called Punish a Muslim Day, and that man was arrested and jailed. Whatever you think about when you think of Islamophobia, it's definitely something that stirs the emotions. It touches into people's real everyday lives. And so I don't want this afternoon just to be about definitions and about the technicalities, but we are going to try and keep in mind the very human stories that there are behind this difficult topic. So just a couple of words before we get into that. I am looking at British Christian responses to Islamophobia. That's not to say that everybody in this survey is going to be British. There have been plenty of those from outside of the country who are at different times have been in the country and who've been part of the discussion here. You might think of people like Peter Riddell, who was at the London School of Theology, or Daniel Madigan, who's spent time and passes through this country, something like John Azuma. So plenty of other voices speaking to this context. And then, of course, plenty of British people who have gone and have voices elsewhere as well. And I think I saw David Marshall coming into the room, and David, very much part of the World Council of Churches, before he stepped down recently, based in Switzerland. And so we have this flow in and out of the country. And then sometimes when people are on Facebook or Twitter, it's impossible to know where they are. I'm not delving into social media a lot, but that's definitely part of it as well. So we're not hermetically sealed here. It is going to be largely focused on Britain, but remembering that it's part of a global conversation as well. And then just a word about the word Christian there in the title. Christian can obviously have a huge range of definitions and connotations. We could look at some of the political far right that adopt Christian symbols. Think of the British National Party, the British Freedom Party. That's Jada Franson, who 2 or 3 years ago, or maybe less, used a symbol of a church in some of her campaigning. And Nick Baines, Bishop of Leeds, was very quick to point out that he hadn't given any permission for her to use those symbols. And so sometimes the Christian identity or the Christian name is co-opted by others. I'm not going to be looking at those who do that. I'm not looking at the politically far right. I'm rather more looking at practicing Christians today, but from right across different denominations, Protestant, Catholic, Orthodox, different traditions within those, be they evangelical, mainstream, whether it's the established church or the nonconformist churches. There's going to be a whole range. And I'm looking at published material in books, in newspapers, some journal articles, touch a little bit on social media. And some of this comes from observation too, although this is not an exhaustive, rigorous study. It's not based on survey data. But a few years ago in 2019, as part of our Christians and Muslims in Public Life project here at CMCS Oxford, we did run a workshop that touched on this whole topic. We had a couple of Muslim speakers. The participants in the workshop were largely Christians, and we asked them to give us some reasoned arguments for the positions that they held in relation to Islamophobia and the definitions of Islamophobia. Those can be found on our website, and I'll give you the URL link a little bit later. But some of what I've included here in this survey has been drawn from those observations and that workshop as well. So, Islamophobia. I was saying that earlier the definition of Islamophobia is somewhat contentious. But before we talk about a definition of Islamophobia, I want to go back to that visceral, lived reality of how Muslims feel about Islamophobia. And if you listen to Muslim friends and colleagues talking about Islamophobia, you'll know this is a very real concern and a lived concern for them. And so, in looking at some of the issues that underlie the desire to try and define and to do something about this phenomenon, we've already thought a little bit about attacks on Muslims in the street, some of which have been fatal even here in this country. But there's also the whole sense of disadvantage that many Muslims in this country feel. A few years ago, following the 2011 census, the Muslim Council of Britain pulled together some of the statistics that show the reality of life in Britain as a Muslim. They looked at some of the employment situation of Muslims, and they found that only 1 in 5 Muslims were in full-time employment. That compares with 1 in 3 in the general population, and the rate of unemployment nearly double that amongst Muslims as compared to the rest of the population. And so a feeling of disadvantage, and even a more recent report finding that Muslims receive on average lower wages than others. And so this contributes to a sense of neglect or having fallen behind or being disadvantaged. Housing too, in that same report by the MCB, found that 46% of Muslims in this country live in the 10% most deprived areas, and only a very small percentage live in the least deprived. A very high percent of Muslims living in social housing, and a correspondingly low percentage of Muslims owning their own homes. Education too, Muslim, particularly Asian boys, falling behind in education. And all of these things, in a sense, being felt to be a result of their Muslimness. Even more recently, during the COVID pandemic, the Muslim Council put out a report looking at deaths amongst the BME population, but particularly amongst Muslims. They cross-referenced it with census data, and they found out that Muslim men were 2.5 times more likely to die of COVID than Christian men. And I thought initially that must mean just white men, but in actual fact, with the cross-referencing to the census data, they had actually tied it to religious affiliation. Women too, almost twice as likely to die if they were from a Muslim background. Very high percentage of national health workers are from a BAME background, many of whom would be Muslims, and many of whom lost their jobs and suffered in other ways during the COVID pandemic. So a sense of disadvantage, but also a sense of prejudice, where Muslims feel that there is a prejudice against them, and the Muslim Council of Britain again talk about a double penalty, where Muslims face not just a racial disadvantage, but also a religious disadvantage because of what they would view as Islamophobia. And then also in this whole idea of Islamophobia is an idea not just of disadvantage and prejudice, but also of misrepresentation, and Muslims feeling very much that they are misrepresented. There's a lot of fake news that has been identified. The European report on Islamophobia looked at fake posts on social media, how many times they are shared, and how rarely they go challenged. They said that 90% of social media posts containing misinformation about Islam went uncorrected. So a sense where Muslims feel that they are being misrepresented, and particularly in the mainstream media. And the Muslim Council of Britain for a long time have had a project looking at media representation. Miqdad Versi at the MCB has particularly been trying to hold national newspapers to account and to make them publish retractions when they publish things that are inaccurate or untrue. And in their research, they found that a very high percentage of articles that refer to Muslims portray Muslims negatively, with over a third of all the articles misrepresenting or generalizing about Muslims, and their main theme or content being about terrorism. And so, if you like, that's the real background to this discussion around Islamophobia. It's very much a reality, issues faced by the Muslim community here in this country, as well as in other places around the world. And so I do just need to say a few things about definitions of Islamophobia before we particularly look at Christian responses. There's been quite a history of definitions over the last few years. The word can be traced right back to the 1920s, but it was really towards the end of the 1990s that it became common coinage. And it was the Runnymede Trust report on Islamophobia, a challenge to us all, that produced one of the early definitions, which was it was a dread or hatred of Islam, and therefore a fear or dislike of all or most Muslims. That was a very short definition, but they did very helpfully include a framework for thinking about what they called closed versus open views of Islam, with the closed views being representative of the Islamic phobic approaches. And this is still a framework I actually find quite helpful for thinking about some of these issues. And it's really to do with whether Muslims are presented as being a monolithic group, or whether their diversity is recognized and so on, and the degree to which they are seen as being included within society, or they're seen as being outside and being an enemy to society. I'll leave you to look at a little bit more of those dyads. And I should say that I'll make this PowerPoint available after the seminar, because there are a lot of quotes that I will have on the PowerPoint, so you'll be able to get hold of that. Very importantly, the Runnymede report made the point that whilst Islamophobia is an issue, and they were trying to define it, they also said that it is not intrinsically phobic or prejudiced to disagree with or to disapprove of Muslim beliefs, laws, or practices. And this is something that becomes very important in later debate, and particularly for Christians, as we will see. As definitions developed of Islamophobia, they began to include the idea that Islamophobia was in some way linked to race. Chris Allen has been a very prominent academic looking at Islamophobia in this country, and has produced several different definitions. But one of his early definitions here says that Islamophobia is similar in theory, function, and purpose to racism. And again, we will see this theme recurring as we go to look at some of the critique of these definitions. He later produced a definition of Islamophobia that was actually a parallel to a definition produced by the International Holocaust Remembrance Association's definition of anti-Semitism. It literally just replaces the word Jew with Muslim. And this says that it's a certain perception of Muslims which may be expressed as hatred towards Muslims, and goes on from there. And the IHRA definition will come up again later in the discussion. I'm not expecting you to remember all of these definitions, but I think it's just helpful to see something of the development of this idea. On the 20th anniversary of the Runnymede Trust report, the Runnymede Trust produced another report, and they gave a short definition of Islamophobia as being anti-Muslim racism, a very short, succinct definition, which they then expanded. And this is a definition that's shared by the MEND organization as well. They expanded to say Islamophobia is any distinction, exclusion, or restriction towards or preference against Muslims or those perceived to be Muslims that has the purpose or effect of nullifying or impairing the recognition, enjoyment, or exercise on an equal footing of human rights and fundamental freedoms. And so that's a rather more developed definition, but again with this, including this idea of racism. And then most recently, this is the final definition I'm going to touch on, was a definition produced by the All-Party Parliamentary Group on British Muslims in the British Parliament. And again, this very much uses the idea of racism. It says that Islamophobia is rooted in racism and is a type of racism that targets expressions of Muslimness or perceived Muslimness. And so holding those ideas in the back of our mind, I would say that before we look at the Christian responses to Islamophobia themselves, that plenty of other people have done research or polling on this topic, and quite often Christians and those of a religious disposition come out quite badly in polling on their attitudes towards Islam and Muslims. And so the Pew Forum report back in 2018 found that in Britain, 45% of church-attending Christians say Islam is fundamentally incompatible with British values and culture. And that's higher than the general population and those who don't attend church and who have no religion. And indeed, in their report amongst Western Europeans in general, they found that among Christians, all levels of practice, there was a much higher likelihood of anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim, and anti-Jewish opinion. Other reports have found a similar sort of thing. Earlier this year, there was a report out of University of Birmingham that looked at all sorts of factors, but one of the factor in opinions or attitudes towards Muslims was religious affiliation, and they found that those who identify with the Church of England were significantly likely to have very negative views of Muslims. Now, this was maybe needs to be nuanced a little bit, because they also said that whilst those who belong to the Church of England have these negative views, they also found that people with strong religious beliefs attending religious meetings actually tended to be more positive towards Muslims on the whole. And so their gloss on this was that those who identify as being members of the Church of England do tend to be older and of a certain socio-economic profile that also predisposes them towards those sorts of views as well. So maybe there are other reasons at play here. But there are plenty of reports that have found that Christians, particularly those with a traditional view or authoritarian views, have negative views of Muslims. So with that rather long background, I just want to go on to look at 5 different types of responses that I have seen in Christian literature or in some of the other sources that I mentioned earlier. So 5 distinct reactions to Islamophobia. And firstly is one that I would call critical concern. And that concern often is to do with definitions. And we've seen some of these definitions. And certainly at the workshop day that we had with the Christians and Muslims in public life, one of the issues came up was the whole parallel between the definition of anti-Semitism and this definition of Islamophobia. And even though the definition in itself of anti-Semitism wasn't so problematic, it was actually some of the text that goes around the definition that was felt to be detrimental to expression and free speech, and particularly in the anti-Semitic case, support for the Palestinian cause as well. It was, of course, pointed out that all definitions need to be interpreted, and so however carefully you write your definition, you will find that people can interpret these things in different ways, and so any definition is going to be problematic. But in the whole discussion of Islamophobia, the very fact that it's called a phobia gives rise to debate. And so there was a lot of discussion around the fact that, in actual fact, not all fears are irrational. And so, as Bishop Michael Nazir Ali, former bishop in the Church of England, puts it, he says, "I see Islamophobia as an unreasonable fear of all Muslims without taking into account their beliefs, their direction in life, and what tradition of Islam they come from." And he says it's very important to distinguish that from a reasonable fear. And he particularly mentions terrorism in that case. But probably the sharpest criticism, and particularly of the all-parliamentary party definition of Islamophobia, centres around its use or the concept of race, and the degree to which you can actually consider Muslims as a race, and then also their use of the term Muslimness, which is considered to be very unclear and maybe unhelpful. And I think whilst within social science, the definition of race can very easily be expanded to include concepts other than ethnic background when they are characteristics shared by a whole group within society. I think it's also true that in common usage, that this idea of race can very easily seem to be problematic to people. And so Steve Bell, in his most recent book, calls, actual fact, not just this definition of Islamophobia, but just the concept of Islamophobia itself. He calls it a clumsy concept that doesn't really achieve its purpose. And so he says it's a well-meant statement, but that it is flawed in that it conflates race, culture, and religion as one. So very much a feeling that Islam is a religion, and so Muslims are not a race, they're a religious group. And going back to our discussion at the workshop day, several people suggested that a better parallel rather than race would be that of nationality or citizenship. Yes, you are born into a citizenship, but you can also choose to change your citizenship at some point. And so that was felt to be a more helpful parallel. But Bell goes on to point out that it's not just the concept of race, but picking up on the idea of Muslimness and in the inclusion of culture in that. He says that that can very easily shut down whole areas of discussion that are actually very important, because it's very difficult sometimes to distinguish what is cultural about a religion and what actually applies to its teachings and its texts as well. So for many Christians, and I could have put many other quotes here, this link between Islamophobia, Muslims, and race, or the cultural aspects, is deeply unhelpful. So secondly, along with the concern over poor definitions, there's a concern that the definitions should focus on Muslims rather than on Islam. This is partly so that Muslims themselves will be helped and protected. Going back to our original comments about the issue and the phenomena itself, is very much that Muslims are experiencing something they need to be protected from. And so Steve Bell goes on to say that he believes that these things do not help Muslims, but rather these definitions have actually made things worse. Coming from a rather different position, the Barnabas Fund, writing in Evangelicals Now, noted that actually here in Oxford, where I'm sat today, the City Council have accepted or adopted the all-party parliamentary group definition of Islamophobia, and they go on to say that that's very unhelpful, but they are keen to say that Islamophobia would be a preferable term because it's about protecting people, but they're very keen that the ideology is not what should be protected. Others, Christian Concern, here make a similar point about preferring something that would refer to anti-Muslim hatred and making sure that it's not protecting the criticism of Islam. And so there's a general concern that poor definitions might be misused or might have unintended consequences, and that they might also close down honest discussion. And so almost all of the opinions, and this was a quote from a Catholic writer in the Catholic Herald, responding to Mehdi Hassan, a Muslim writer. This Catholic feels that he himself would be guilty of Islamophobia on the basis of some of the things that Hassan includes under the Islamophobia banner. And what he wants to say is that, yes, there's different opinions about revelation and about the place of law. He looks particularly at Sharia and also looks at the Catholic canons. He makes the point that anybody who is anti-Catholic could look at the Catholic canon law and make a lot of the same points that are made about Islam and Muslims. And so he says what's needed is a deeper conversation about the foundations. And he believes that if we actually could get to that, that would lead to dissipating Islam. So that's all part of the critical concern about motives. Secondly, I see suspicion of motives. There's a suspicion amongst some Christians that Muslims are willfully constructing definitions of Islamophobia that would protect Islam rather than Muslims. Part of this is rooted in a history of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, trying to introduce a law into the UN about the defamation of religion, which was largely unsuccessful, but other initiatives as well. Writing in the Church of England newspaper, which is the evangelical wing of the Church of England, an author responding in 2015 to the suggestion that there should be a Muslim manifesto in the election that year. And this manifesto was looking to defend the right to a Muslim way of life, mentioned halal and religious clothing and circumcision and so on. And so he says, I want to ask some questions about this. And he goes on to say, circumcision of just males or of females? Am I Islamophobic if I talk about the circumcision of females and so on? And he says, no doubt for raising these matters, I shall be accused of Islamophobia, whatever can be attached to that expression. And so this suspicion is really that the definitions will be used to shut down debate on Islam. Patrick Soukdeo often touches on this in his book, and he says the concept of Islamophobia has been used in recent years as a way of shielding Islam and Muslims from criticism. And I already mentioned the legal case in Australia, where Daniel Scott was teaching a Christian audience his view of the Islamic tradition, including the person of Muhammad. Some Muslims in the audience took offense, and then under a particular Act of Parliament in Victoria, Australia, took him to court. He was convicted, found guilty, but then later was cleared on appeal. But I think there's a fear that such legal moves will be used if there is a legalized definition of Islamophobia. And in turn, that sort of definition will be used to shut down freedom of speech and of an oversensitivity to political correctness. Something mentioned in a report, there's another Barnabas-related report. It's evident that political correctness is inadvertently threatening to limit freedom of speech and argument in relation to Islamophobia. Christian Concern saying something similar. This is a criticism the All Parliamentary Party group says the authors of the report appeared to want to silence criticism of Islam or of Muhammad, and it goes on to say there's a flagrant attempt to curtail freedom of speech. And so many would argue that there are already laws in place to protect from this sort of problem. And again, writing in the Church of England newspaper, somebody makes that point and suggests or asks the question why Muslims should have preferential treatment when everybody else would be protected by existing laws. So that's the suspicious response, if you like. A third response is, I guess, a concern or fear that Christians will withdraw because of a fear of being accused of Islamophobia. And so again, this is an editorial in the Church of England newspaper, says that for too long, Western European leaders have feared that any criticism of Muslim regimes will lead to accusations of racism or Islamophobia. And it applies this to a conspiracy of silence around things like the abuse of young girls, including here in Oxford, because of fear of being accused of either racism or Islamophobia. Tim Dieppe at Christian Concern, again, believes that the real problem here is a fear of being branded Islamophobic, and he tries to coin the word Islamophobia, which is a very, very long word, but you get the idea of the concern about the fear that surrounds these things. And that such concern or fears will lead to Muslims retreating from engaging with Muslims. Peter Riddell, writing several years ago in Evangelicals Now, says that Westerners feel guilty about colonialism and few volunteer for mission amongst Muslims. Amongst claims of Islamophobia, there is a caution about reaching out to Muslims in Britain. So a concern amongst Christians that this whole Islamophobia debate will make Christians more fearful. And that this means that Islam will then be taught uncritically. Patrick Sukdeo, again, looking at schools, believes that the result of this emphasis on Islamophobia is a tendency to teach Islam more sympathetically than Christianity. And others have made the same point about universities as well, where they see an increasing reticence to be critical of Islam, often because of funding. A fourth response to the Islamophobia that I see in Christian writing is an emphasis on reciprocity, by which I mean Christians saying, well, hold on, yes, if we're legislating on that or defining that for Muslims, what about Christians? What about the freedoms of Christian minorities in Islamic majority context, for instance, around building churches? Caroline Cox, a baroness in the House of Lords, wrote several years ago, should Muslims not acknowledge that there are few Muslim countries that offer Christians, Jews, or those of other religions the same freedom to practice their religion that Muslims enjoy in the West? Sukdeo again saying that Christians can't build churches in Saudi. So is there an argument for trying to negotiate for reciprocal permission for the building of churches in Muslim contexts before allowing Muslims to build mosques in the West? This idea of reciprocity has been picked up by others as well. Again, Bishop Michael Nazir Ali talking about it, but it may be in not quite such stark terms. He says, I don't mean a tit for tat, but really a common commitment to basic human freedoms throughout the world. So something of much more of an agreed nature together. Archbishop George Carey also used to frequently mention reciprocity in his speeches in the House of Lords. Others have emphasized the treatment of Christians in other places, hashtag anti-Christianism. Archbishop Angelos, the Coptic Archbishop in this country, has quite often tweeted about this and expressing a real concern for Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, but at the same time, shouldn't we recognize anti-Christianism and being concerned about attacks on Christians, particularly in his native Egypt, of course. This has led some to talk about Christianophobia or even Christophobia. And Rupert Short, who was an editor in the Times Literary Supplement, produced a book under that title, and he says that Christians are targeted more than any other body of believers in the world. And of course, that was mirrored in Mount Stephen's report for the Foreign Office here in this country on persecution of Christians around the world. And others have coined the term Westophobia, saying there's been much talk of public Islamophobia, but there's no mention made of Westophobia. And Peter Riddell, when he was at London School of Theology, actually produced a whole report on Westophobia, looking at basically anti-Western statements in Islamic discourse. There are plenty of Christians who are very critical of this idea of reciprocity. Tim Dieppe, maybe surprisingly, of Christian concern, says that he doesn't like this competition for victim status. So he's reluctant to use the term Christianophobia and believes that it could actually also be used to silence criticism of Christianity. And he says, well, I'm very happy for Christianity to be criticized because I want to criticize Islam. Others are more maybe sensitive to the fact that reciprocity really for Christians shouldn't be about what we receive in return. Richard Sudworth, who's the Archbishop's advisor on interfaith at Lambeth, wrote that our goal is reciprocity, but even if we do not receive anything in return, our path is one of selfless love. Colin Chapman, writing a few years ago, said Jesus has encouraged his followers to take the initiative and follow the golden rule, however the other party behaves. And then just very recently, Shaukat Mukari, a Syrian Christian based in France, writing in the French context, says restricting religious freedom of Muslims in France would amount to holding them responsible for the politics of Islamic countries, and this would be deeply unfair. He says the principle of reciprocity is not actually a Christian principle any more than the law of retaliation is. So we're concerned about reciprocity as well. Final position that I've observed on this Christian response to Islamophobia is one of compassion and solidarity. Plenty of Christians have come out to condemn attacks on Muslims. Writing in the Catholic Tablet, Cardinal Vincent Nichol gives a very typical condemnation of attacks, the one in Finsbury Park, together with people over this country. I'm appalled at this attack. I have assured the leadership of the mosque of our prayers and support. Violence breeds violence, hatred breeds hatred. Every one of us must repudiate hatred and violence. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, although interestingly he doesn't mention Islamophobia in his book about reimagining Britain, has often come out with condemnation of different attacks. Here, talking to the Muslim Council of Wales, he says, fear and destruction, Islamophobia, mosque burning suspicion, they are simply wrong. They are sin. And again, he called the tax in New Zealand blasphemy. Hatred of Muslim denies and blasphemes Christ. Those who co-opt Christian language and history for hatred commit blasphemy. We are with you. The Christian Muslim Forum Bishop Toby Howarth of Bradford, often coming out with statements of support for Muslims at times of crisis. And the Christian Muslim Forum itself, often on its Twitter account, things like Christians and Muslims stand in solidarity against the contemptible letters those punish a Muslim day. All hate crimes should be reported. So plenty of Christians there condemning attacks, and also some very touching acts of solidarity. I'd be very interested to hear if you have other examples, but here in Oxford, after one of the national terrorist attacks, Christians from here in Oxford went up to the Mansell Way Mosque, and they were handing out flowers to Muslims as they came out of the mosque, and got a very positive response from Muslims there. One of the things that Christians want to do to try and counter Islamophobia is to promote accurate understandings of Islam. Many different examples I could have noted. This is a Catholic course that was held a few years ago at the Focolare Centre. It's run by Damien Howard, and the aim of the course was to encourage people to see the world through Muslim eyes. In other words, to understand Islam and the world as Muslims see it. Our very own Ida Glaser, and I think Colin Chapman's with us today, has also written on this, talking about one of the 10 commandments being that you shall not bear false witness against your neighbour. And so talking about the importance of speaking truthfully about Muslims, not misrepresenting them. And certainly that's something that we very much try to do here at the centre. And so many Christians are keen to try and promote religious literacy, a better quality of discourse about religion in the media and so on. Some Christians who are involved in the Religion Media Centre, people like Christopher Landau, who was a BBC correspondent, working on helping the media to report and understand religion and belief accurately. Christians wanting to promote conversation, might call it dialogue, between Christians and Muslims. So just as I finish, I know I've taken a few minutes longer than maybe I should have been, just want to look at the way forward and to thinking about definitions of Islamophobia. We really need something that would actually address the real issues, the felt needs of Muslims in this country who do feel vulnerable, who feel disadvantaged. And certainly a Christian response should demonstrate love and compassion and standing with our Muslim neighbours. And so that definition, I think, does need to avoid obvious contention. Any definition is going to be difficult. But I think for as long as a definition includes something to do with race, or even if it includes Islam as the object rather than Muslims as people, then it is going to be contentious. And so maybe definition needs to be something that focuses on Muslims as people. And a book that's just quite recently come out in the American context, this is a Catholic theologian in the US, proposes this definition of Islamophobia as the prejudice and discrimination that targets people based on their perceived association with Islam and Muslims. And I quite like that. It keeps the focus on the people and the prejudice because of that association. I'm sure there would be problems and criticisms with this definition too, but it does seem to be more helpful. Going to skip on past some of this. There are plenty of Muslims who are critical of the word Islamophobia and suggest maybe other words like anti-Muslimism would be better. But just to say in finishing, a Christian response really needs to be one that is biblical. And there is more than enough material in the Bible that would challenge Christians to think about not bearing false witness, about loving the stranger who is in the land, loving their neighbour, even if they think they may be the enemy, and remembering that Jesus said, I was a stranger and you invited me in. And so maybe on that point, I'll stop sharing and I will pause and open it up for discussion.